Hi, folks. Thank you for joining us this morning for our candidate webinar with our Executive Director, Zach Sheehan. And today we have with us the Executive Director of Housing Action New Hampshire, Alyssa. We will give folks a minute or two to join here, and I will quickly go through the format. I know at this point most of the folks on here have joined us for the webinars that we've put on in the last couple of weeks. But just for anybody who hasn't, um, in a minute or two, I will turn it over to Zach, who will talk quickly about the last two webinars that we have coming up, and then he will present for about 20 minutes. And then we will, at that point, hear from Alyssa. If you have questions throughout the webinar, put them in the chat, and we will move to Q&A at about 12:45. So any questions that you put in the chat, I will read off to Zach and Alyssa at that point. This webinar is being recorded, and all of the content that you see today, the slide decks from both Zach and Alyssa will be on our website and emailed out to folks later this afternoon. So with that, I will kick it over to Zach.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here for the next installment in our candidate webinar series. For those of you who have not attended one so far, my name is Zach Sheehan. I'm the Executive Director here at the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit advocacy organization. We do some advocacy, we do a lot of educational work all around the state, talking to school boards, communities, civic organizations. We talked to the staff and administration at Pembroke Academy yesterday morning, for example, just for some professional development. And a lot of the work we do kind of talk about school funding, property taxes at a high level, and the impact on people all over the state and some of the things they can do to engage. So today we have, as Casey mentioned, we have Alyssa from Housing Action New Hampshire. So I'm very excited to hear some of the things she'll be sharing a little later this morning. And then next week, back to our normal noon schedule, we'll be hearing from Moms Rising on Tuesday and Reaching Higher New Hampshire on Thursday to kind of round out this webinar series. And just one more piece for here at the beginning, just for those who might not have joined before. While this is geared towards candidates, anyone's welcome to attend. We're recording these, sending out the recording afterwards, putting them on our website. No one in this series is endorsing or supporting candidates. The intent here is to provide information for folks running or who currently hold elected office on a lot of the issues facing New Hampshire today. And really get to know some of these organizations. And we really encourage people to reach out to us, to any of the partner organizations we've worked with. We'll make sure you have our contact info after, and use this as a resource. With that, I will go ahead and dig into what we've got this morning. So to start at the top, just kind of a recap for those that may not have seen this. This is the revenue breakdown of New Hampshire public schools last year. About $3.8 billion. This is a significant amount of money for a small state. We do spend a good amount on our public schools here in the state. We value them generally. We vote with our own pocketbooks to increase, and sustain this support largely through our own property taxes. We do, on average, have very good public schools around the state. But again, those averages kind of hide some of the deep disparities amongst different communities, different schools, access to opportunities for different students. So just the breakdown here real quick, about 8.7, almost 9% comes from the federal government. State revenues hover around 20%. They're a little under last year. 20% coming from the state is the smallest share of a state's contribution to the public school system in the country by quite a long shot. And then the other side of that is the property taxpayers make up over 70% of all of the funding in New Hampshire for our public schools. We've dug into it in the past a little bit, kind of why that's a problem, largely due to pretty dramatically varying property values around the state that result in very different property tax rates. I'm not going to get into that as much today. One piece I will, break open a little bit, which we did a session on last week, was SWEPT. And the reason that we add SWEPT to local property taxes here for that 70% is that while SWEPT is the statewide education property tax, it's raised and retained locally. So if you add these pieces together, it's about $2.7 billion is that local property tax plus SWEPT element. According to many court rulings, Supreme Court rulings, the large share, if not all of that, is the responsibility of the state of New Hampshire. And currently it's made up entirely by local property taxpayers. So now here's the kind of question that we want to dig into a little more today. What would it look like? Oftentimes people think of taxes as being additive. This is not anchored in a specific policy solution. It's an example here. When we talk about shifting that responsibility for paying for an adequate education from local property taxpayers to the state, we're not often talking about an additive amount to spend on public education necessarily. This came up a bunch in the Conval Superior Court ruling, the Conval school funding lawsuit, where they're arguing for an increased base adequacy cost. They're not necessarily arguing for an expansion of the amount of money we're spending on schools overall. They're largely arguing for a shift in responsibility so that the state is picking up a larger share of that. So just again, kind of this visual as an example, here's what we're currently spending. And what would it look like if we shifted, say, a chunk of that 20% from local property taxpayers, reduced that burden to the state? Tiny bit more history until we kind of dig into that question relative to SWEPT, because I think it shows an interesting historical example of a state tax that, when paired with the funding, is not necessarily additive. So what I mean by that is, when SWEPT was first implemented, it was following the Claremont Supreme Court decisions. This was the solution that the legislature at the time decided on. A little bit of interesting history, just for folks who may not know. But one of another policy proposal at the time was, in fact, a statewide broad-based income tax to pay for education funding. It was a bill, the prime sponsor of the bill was a Democrat in the House. It passed a House of Representatives where the Republicans were the majority. And then Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen signaled she would veto the bill, and that effectively killed it. So some interesting kind of partisanship that maybe people might not associate with today, but also the fact that an income tax was on the table. It eventually did not go through, and so the legislature and the solution was this new statewide education property tax. When it was implemented, it was about a $6 additive tax to people's bills. The property taxpayers all over the state were paying that. But when paired with a new adequacy funding formula, it actually decreased the average property tax bill around the state. So we're adding about $6 to everyone's property tax bill, but the average bill dropped from $17.68 to $13.26. Now, how that can happen, and the reason that did happen, is because the adequacy funding took into account, it wasn't perfect, but to different degrees, took into account where that funding was needed. What I mean by that is some communities that had, at the time, like we see today, really high tax rates because they were trying to squeeze more out of their lower property values, they got additional funding from this adequacy aid. And that helped really kind of level the extreme disparities between some of the communities that had really low tax rates and those that had exorbitantly high tax rates. So this is an interesting historical example that, taxes are not always additive when paired with, creative and equitable funding solutions. Since then, there's been a number of changes to SWEPT. In the late 2000s, a number of property wealthy communities branded themselves as the donor towns. You may have heard that concept. It was very clever branding. And they effectively got lobbied to get the law changed to make it that SWEPT was no longer a state tax, didn't go to the state. It was raised, retained, kept locally. So even though on your property tax bill you see local ed and state ed, that state ed money does not go to the state, it stays local. It resulted in a few things, one of which was the creation of negative tax rates. This is kind of a fascinating concept. So effectively what happens is in some communities with maybe one student or no students, many of them up in the northern part of the state, up in Coos County, they have to raise SWEPT, right? Because it's a state tax, but it's kept locally. And you have to use SWEPT money on education. So they're raising this tax, the state tax, keeping the money locally, but then they couldn't spend it because they don't have any education costs. So they raise this money in one hand and then set negative local education property tax rates on the other hand, and they zero out. So the state can claim, and they are in court, everyone's paying their SWEPT. It's a state tax. Everyone's paying it. What they do locally is their decision. The effect of that, though, is that there are communities that are not paying towards this state obligation, a state tax, to fund an adequate education. One more note is that this burden on local property taxpayers has increased by over $600 million in the past 10 years, where the state's contribution has increased only 47. Okay, so to dig in a little bit to kind of the implications and the kind of ramifications of this system. Folks might have seen this before. This is data that came out early this past year, in January, February of this year by the Institute on Taxation Economic Policy. They're a national organization that does this type of analysis for every state in the country. This is the overall share of your taxes, the percentage that go to different types of taxes. Lowest income bracket on the left, less than $35,000, up to the top 1% being over $721,000 here in New Hampshire. The largest bar, the largest share for every income group, property taxes. But you can see it's almost a perfectly regressive system, where in general, on average, the more money you make, the smaller percentage are going towards property taxes. One of the largest driving factors there, school funding system. If you're able to afford the price of admission or afford the increasing property taxes in some of the wealthier communities, in general, your property tax rate is going to be smaller. And this property tax, this does take into account the impact on rents. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly how they do that, but I do know if you have questions, you can go look at the methodology at ITEP, and that does take into account rents, oftentimes because it's important to understand the impact of property taxes on rents, especially for folks who may not be able to afford buying houses. We'll obviously hear a little bit more about that later from Alyssa. Now, what have we changed recently in our tax system? The biggest one that's going to be phasing out in January is we reduced the interest and dividends tax. And this is, according to ITEP, the largest impact of reducing that tax, eliminating that tax that will phase out in January. The largest tax break comes from folks who, in general, are in the top 5% of earners. Now I'm going to turn to some analysis that's been done by the Fiscal Policy Institute to kind of help explain this a little more explicitly. This is the title of this report they put out on March 30th of last year. And here are a few of the main pieces that I want folks to come away with. One, this tax, the interest and dividends tax, which the rationale for repealing it was twofold. One, that it was technically an income tax, and we don't have income taxes in New Hampshire. So to kind of live up to our claim, we have to repeal this. And two, that this was really harming seniors on fixed incomes who were making, had kind of put money into the stock market and to get other interest or dividends, and they had worked their whole careers and were getting income off that and living off of that. Both of those are pretty misleading. The significant portion, as you can see here, over half of the interest and dividends paid by Grand Stayers with more than $200,000 in just income from that interest or dividends. And Fiscal Policy Institute went on a little further to give an example here. So a single family home worth $200,000 in Manchester, homeowner would pay about $5,000 in property taxes, regardless of their income or interest or investment assets. On the other hand, homeowner, with a house worth $2 or $3 million, with assets in excess of an estimate there was $3 to $10 million in assets that would generate that $200,000 in income and for interest and dividends. Now they're not gonna have to pay any taxes on that. And about 87% of folks across the state in New Hampshire do not live in a household that pays this tax. And I'm harping on this, kind of pointing this out, because when we think about the policy decisions that impact the ability to, in this case, we're really focusing on what is the role of public policy to impact how much we're paying in property taxes, which impacts people's ability to afford buying a house and also rent. We're on the one hand saying we don't have the funds, right, to increase school funding or to extend meaningful property tax relief. On the other hand, we're eliminating a tax that was bringing in between $135 and $150 million a year. Another tax to look at that the Fiscal Policy Institute has done some good analysis on. This was from an issue brief from last August. The state has been steadily reducing business taxes over the past 7 or 8 years, and then by their estimates, lost between $496 and $729 million. They also explicitly pointed out that those business tax revenue growth that we've seen recently in the past 2 or 3 years has not been spurred by those tax rate reductions, despite claims to the complete contrary. Also, it appears that there's no correlation between business profits tax, which most of that business profits tax is paid by large international corporations such as your Walmarts. No correlation between reducing that and overall economic growth to the region. And also that the money lost from not having that revenue from business taxes could have gone to programs that would have impacted low and moderate incomes, which likely would have had a much more significant positive effect on economic growth. And here's kind of that last piece, which I think is something that we really want to highlight, which is, this is hundreds of millions of dollars. They said it could have been eliminated the statewide property tax for 1 or 2 years. And also it could have which would have provided much more effective economic stimulus for New Hampshire than reducing those corporate tax rates. A few other pieces as we're thinking about, again, when we talk about shifting from the school funding perspective, we talk about shifting that responsibility from local property taxpayers to the state. It's not talking about spending more money necessarily. It's talking about reallocating who is spending that money. And by reducing, business profits taxes in the way that we have, right, who is spending that money? Now we're downshifting more of that into local property taxpayers. Mm-hmm. So the same time period that we lost between $500 and $700 million in business tax revenue, remember that burden on the downshifting of expenses to local property taxpayers for public schools increased by $600 million, right? It's not a one-to-one correlation, but like we're losing revenue on one hand, and the proportion of funding that local property taxpayers are kicking into our school system is increasing by a pretty similar amount. There's a few ways in which we could work to make some of our taxes, specifically, the statewide education property tax, take into account people's ability to pay. We have this program right now in New Hampshire called the Low and Moderate Income Property Tax Relief Program. Sounds pretty good, right? Take into account someone's ability to pay their property taxes, provide some mechanism for folks to get relief and help if they can't pay their property taxes. The problem is we have criminally underfunded this system for years, to the point where in the past few years, for example, in 2021, only 5,500 claims, as opposed to 27,000 2 decades ago, were distributed, averaging $236 per claim. The average property tax bill that year, $7,500. $200 is not meaningful help for folks that are having trouble of paying their property taxes. And I'm sure these have gotten just expanded even more the past few years. A lot of communities are doing reassessments, and property taxes continue to be a really impactful piece of people's ability to stay in their homes or to afford buying new houses. And so, for example, we had a bill just this past year, House Bill 569, that would have increased the amount of funding going to this specific system, the low and moderate property tax relief program, to $30 million and raise some of the limits. Because right now the limits and the cutoffs to qualify for these this program are so low that basically no one qualifies. And again, you can see how little relief you get. That's just frankly not worth people's time. So again, what are we making? What decisions are we making at the public policy level that could actually meaningfully help people, specifically with their property taxes, which continue to be really hard for a lot of folks to pay, as opposed to cutting things like the interest and dividends tax wholesale, or business profits taxes. One more example here was SWEPT specifically, and then we'll wrap up and I'll kick it on over to Alyssa, is looking at something called a homestead exemption. This is just some kind of rough average math using numbers from the Department of Revenue Administration for kind of total property tax base that we tax in this state right now. So in 2022, the amount of property value that was taxed for SWEPT was about $300 billion. Millions, it's a large number, right? We have a lot of property value in this state. We have for many years now, we always raise the same exact amount of money from SWEPT, $363 million. I have yet to kind of find a good reason as to why that is. We kind of just locked in that number, and every year we just reduce the rate to raise that same amount of money. So in 2022, the average SWEPT rate was 86 cents per thousand on a property tax bill. It resulted in $300 on your property if it was worth $350,000, almost $400 for a home worth $450,000. Now, for example, if we were to keep SWEPT, make it a true state tax, but still raise that $363 million, but do a homestead exemption, which means that you would not pay SWEPT on the first, say, $200,000 of your home. It's a way to kind of try to help even out the distribution of who's actually paying that. So if we did that, we would reduce the overall base that we're taxing, and the tax rate would go up, right? So the SWEPT rate would go from 86 cents to $1.90. But now we see that the kind of shift here is someone living in a home worth $350,000 would pay about the same amount, a little less actually, $301 to $285. But a home at $450,000 would pay about $100 more. And that increase, you'd see that as you went up the scale, $1 million home, right, for example, would end up paying a good chunk more, whereas the homes under $500,000 would pay a little bit more to about the same. And I point this out because these are the types of conversations that as folks are running for office and are currently in office thinking about legislation for next year, right? This is how you start taking into account how do we restructure some of our taxes, and specifically, the statewide education property tax. How do we start to look at that and really genuinely take into account who has the ability to pay this, who doesn't, and what policy solutions are out there to take that into account that does two things. It looks at how are we funding education, and also looks at who's being harmed currently right now and how can we help alleviate some of that financial burden. So with that, I'm gonna wrap up there. I'm right at 20 minutes, and I'm gonna kick it on over to Alyssa.
Thanks, Zach. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alyssa Margolin. I serve as Director of Housing Action New Hampshire. Housing Action New Hampshire is a statewide coalition working to improve state and federal policy so everyone in New Hampshire has a place to call home. Our members are those who develop, finance, and manage affordable housing properties, homeless service providers, supportive housing providers, public housing agencies, and low-income family advocates. Before I share my screen, I just wanted to say hello before my face gets really small and just thank all of you for attending this morning. I also want to thank Zach and Casey for including housing in their series. I do want to say I relocated here to New Hampshire 20 years ago from DC, and I started my advocacy career on the Hill. And with my first client here in New Hampshire is the Charitable Foundation, and I became quickly fascinated with our state house and have grown to just really admire our citizen legislature and all of those who contribute to making our democracy and our legislature work here in the state. So with that, I'll start my presentation and share my screen. So the data surrounding New Hampshire's affordable housing crisis are sobering. My guess is that many of you are very familiar with this, but I'll start with just how significant of an issue this is for New Hampshire voters. Affordable housing, or the lack thereof, is now the #1 issue for Granite Staters. The UNH Survey Center, in its recent Granite State poll, identified the need for affordable housing as the #1 issue. And this was more than 5 times of any other issue identified in that poll. And another poll taken around the same time from St. Anselm College Center for Ethics found that 75% of New Hampshire voters think that more affordable housing is needed in our state. As you know, for polling, these are pretty large numbers. 61% of voters agree that more multifamily is needed. I think that might shock a lot of folks who serve in the legislature, just because there is perhaps more a debate within legislative circles around the rural character of New Hampshire and multifamily solutions. And yet 61% of New Hampshire voters think it's a much needed solution. And also, as we identify the need for reasonable local and municipal zoning, I think it's surprising to find out that 59% of New Hampshire voters actually want to see changes in their own backyards. Now the data about the crisis. The housing salary, so what you need to earn in New Hampshire per year to afford a typical 2-bedroom apartment in New Hampshire, is now over $73,000. And for a lot of us, that may be really shocking, but that would equal your rent and your energy costs for 30% of your income to meet the cost of housing today. Again, you need to earn over $73,000 to afford a typical 2-bedroom apartment now in New Hampshire. There's a recent statewide housing needs assessment that says that New Hampshire will need 88,395 housing units by the year 2040 if we are to keep pace with just baseline economic growth. And that would include, in that 88,000 number, an additional 23,670 rental units. Today, when you look at the price of units and you line it up with what people earn and what they can afford, only 13% of all of the rental stock is considered affordable. Shifting now to homelessness, we count homelessness via the Housing and Urban Development point-in-time count. This is on one day, and usually at the end of January, where volunteers go out and count the number of people who are seeking shelter in a homeless shelter or in encampments. In 2023, that number increased to 2,441. The Department of Education counts housing and homelessness a little differently and has a different definition of homelessness and counts through the students that they're serving who are facing housing instability. So often if a student is moving from house to house and doubled up, they will get counted in the Department of Ed number. And the latest number I have here is 3,378. The 2024 residential rental cost survey from New Hampshire Housing shows a median rental for a 2-bedroom apartment now above $1,800. So how does this match up with what people are earning in the workforce? This is a new graph that is made available in the 2024 residential rental cost survey, recently released by New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority. And I think it's a clearer way of just understanding the crunch. And so here you have median wages lined up with median rent, and you can see just how this is going to impact the recruitment and retention of workforce. So we know how desperately we need to have our nursing assistants, and they are falling way below the median rent. The same is true for public school teachers, firefighters, etc. I'm going to shift now that I hope that I've convinced you that the housing crisis isn't just hyperbole, to a history of the policy milestones, mostly at the state level in addressing the crisis. And as I look through the attendees here on the in my screen here on the left, or I looked at the attendee list sent to me by Casey this morning, I noted that I have worked with many of you on a lot of these. So let me start by saying thank you for helping us pass what we did. As you know, the New Hampshire Workforce Housing Law is a really important policy we have here on the state. And that was kind of the foundation for everything else that we've worked on. But it basically says that a municipality cannot zone out the development of affordable housing if there is a market for it. But our work to address housing stability for all New Hampshire residents has also led us to partner with many of you on issues like addressing bed bugs and tenants' rights, and also challenges to affordability from the tenant perspective. Another big milestone was the passage of the accessory dwelling unit law in 2016. And I can see that I am reminded that we worked with some of you on that as well. And as you know, Housing Action New Hampshire is interested in improving this law. We had bills to address that the last couple of years, and will likely work with some of you to reintroduce that this coming session. Making sure that we have funding for lead remediation is obviously critical, particularly as the new lead law comes into effect about all rental housing, and the requirement to make sure that it is lead safe for New Hampshire residents, families, and children. We've established a dedicated funding source for our main source of production for affordable housing in the state, the Affordable Housing Fund. Secured a new Medicaid benefit to help with supportive housing services. Established a housing appeals board to provide faster and less expensive review of housing related appeals. Representative Almy, I see that you're attending this morning, worked closely with you on that rent relief piece for those affordable housing developers who really through just kind of a mistake in the law were getting charged more than once for their rent if they had investor transitions in a tax credit deal. And obviously, housing stability was front and center during the pandemic. I remember the first day when we heard the stay-at-home order, and I knew that day that I worked with members who were charged with people who didn't have a home, and worked with a lot of you to secure pandemic-related relief to keep our unhoused in New Hampshire safe and those who serve them. And we've been busy last couple of years passing more reasonable timelines and local practices and providing more tools at the local level, certainly providing additional capital for production, addressing a sustainable homeless services budget, updating our manufactured housing law to make room for this important affordable option. And most recently, the passage of a Homnibus bill that addresses commercial conversions and more reasonable parking standards at the local level. So looking ahead, let me just do a time check here. Looking ahead, what can you expect to see in proposed legislation, and certainly advocates asking about in 2025? I'm sure we'll see a lot of discussion, since we're going into a budget year, around the need for more sustainable funding to the New Hampshire Affordable Housing Fund. Advocates would like legislators to understand that the ups and downs of our funding formula has not done enough to recruit more developers into the affordable space. When you have a market as hot as ours, it is natural for developers to want to build to the highest price point. So in order to get them, incentivize them to serve a market, an unserved market, you need to provide below market rate capital, and that's what state housing trust funds do. And so if you provide more predictability by increasing the real estate transfer tax formula that goes into the fund, we are sending a signal to the developer community that the state is serious about providing that below market rate capital, and then having them build housing with long-term affordability covenants. We also likely seek a robust appropriation to the fund. As you know, there's also been the recent passage of a new housing champion program. This was a proposal in Senator Perkins Coca's bill. It had also been part of Senator Jeb Bradley's prior bills as well. This was passed and funded with a $5 million infrastructure incentive program for municipalities who want to do the right thing in their backyards for housing, but need more water, sewer, or sometimes sidewalk and transportation support, and can do that through infrastructure funding. The Housing Champion program was just approved by the Rules Committee just a couple of months ago. And so you'll start to see New Hampshire Business and Economic Affairs start to roll out this program. I think you'll hear a lot of discussion in 2025 about the regulatory barriers. I think I heard one of the candidates on NHPR this morning addressing some of this. I think housing advocates agree that municipalities have an interest in regulating certainly the public health and environment for its residents. However, municipal regulations are sometimes just used as anti-growth regulations and are actually driving out members of their community, or certainly driving out the next generation because housing has become so affordable. So you see discussions in public policy around more reasonable standards, essentially the state playing a role in saying, like they did last year, of course there's a municipal interest in parking, but it needs to be reasonable. You can't mandate 4 parking spots for 1 ADU, as some communities have been doing, to just keep folks from developing them. I think you'll see, and also a discussion around lot sizing. Obviously, there's a place for large lots, but when an entire community is zoned for 8-acre zoning, you're not going to solve the housing crisis. And so there needs to be at least a percentage of lots that are more reasonably sized. And of course, nothing should be sized that doesn't meet water sewer standards. Water and septic are important, so part of all of this. But I think there are policies that we could propose that say, if you meet water septic standards or on water sewer infrastructure, that you have to have reasonable lot sizing for at least a percentage of the community. There's also a chance to improve the current ADU law. Our state law only requires attached ADUs, but many lots in New Hampshire have barns that are ideal conversions. And so the state law needs to be updated to include attached and detached and allow these by right if they meet water sewer standards. There's also room for discussing about the property rights of someone and the opportunity to create a duplex, triplex, a fourplex with your own property to lend, to do your piece to expand housing stock. Maybe you want to accommodate your adult children or aging parents, or maybe you want to rent, but you have your right on your property to do so. And so the state can play a role in providing that. I think there's more room to provide more incentives to the new Housing Champion program. Obviously, we want to see how that rolls out, but keeping the infrastructure piece funded there will keep communities interested in accessing those kind of resources. I think state agencies can do more around reasonable timelines for permitting approvals. Of course, we have to make sure they have the staff to review and permit. But the legislature last year passed a bill around driveway permitting for residential, saying that DOT had been a bottleneck and then came to an agreement around a 60-day reasonable timeline for permitting. There's a new study committee on the issue of housing for people with disabilities. The situation is dire in many ways. They are the original housing crisis in the state. And I'm really looking forward to working with the committee on policy solutions. Also, I think because the disability community is a great example of this, you often have parents who are forming nonprofits and trying to navigate complex systems of funding, in addition to regulations for development, so providing some kind of technical assistance to help folks navigate the resources available to them to find housing solutions would be a low cost but highly valued assistance piece for many newcomers to the affordable housing development space. And then obviously New Hampshire really wants to provide housing for those people experiencing homelessness. This is a budget year, so we're going to have to make sure that those homeless service contracts are funded at a more sustainable level, and make sure that the eviction prevention programs are funded. We may also want to consider incentives for voucher acceptance. In this very tight market, landlords are not accepting Section 8 vouchers. So can you imagine if you're a low income, say single parent with a couple of kids, you've been on a wait list for 8 years, struggling to pay your rent, finally find out that you received a housing voucher, only to find out that a landlord won't accept them. That's a situation that we're facing now in New Hampshire, and it's really sad to see that families go out, they get extended their voucher for another 90 days and another 90 days only to have to turn it back. In some ways, I've been saying it's almost cruel to say to someone, here's the tool the federal government has provided to help you afford your rent. Good luck using it in the private market. I think when you talk about housing for people who need a little bit more support, whether that's because they're coming out of recovery, have mental health issues, or are facing living with disabilities, there is a challenge to the operational funding model when it comes to that wraparound services, and something that I think we all need to look at. I think you might see in the next couple of years proposals around this Yes in God's Backyard bill that enable faith-based organizations with land to do more to address the issue of supportive housing on their own property. I think we need to expand street outreach, and particularly when it comes to the issue of encampments. There are more compassionate ways of dealing with encampments, and it's the heroic work of street outreach teams who gain the trust of folks who have faced lifetimes of trauma, who are able to prove miracles in rehousing solutions. So we probably want to make sure that we have a more robust funding behind them as well. And then, of course, continuing to provide the technical assistance so that we can roll out the supportive housing Medicaid benefit that we passed, that CMS approved, and that was just rolled out this summer. I think for many homeless service providers, they are not currently Medicaid billers and will need technical assistance to shift over to this resource, which is tremendous because you have the federal government paying, 50% to 90% per individual. So that's what I've prepared for you this morning. Again, I want to thank all of you for attending, all of you for running for office, and then of course to Zach and to Casey for including housing in your candidate for us. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Alyssa. I'm going to add Zach back into the spotlight here, and we'll do Q&A for a couple of minutes. I'm going to start with a couple of questions for Alyssa. This is a good one from Sue. Has anybody studied whether in many more rural communities septic systems, communal or individual septic systems could be affordable?
Has anyone studied whether in many more rural communities, septic systems, communal living could be affordable? My twin used to be the only large one. Oh, I see. Oh, Representative Almy. That is, I don't know the answer to that, but I think when we had Senator Fuller Clark had one of the study commissions, and there was that report did include some assessment of New Hampshire septic. So might be worth looking back at that final report. But essentially what it comes down to is there is, I think, more septic solutions than we are pursuing, and that my hope is that the Housing Champion and its focus on infrastructure angle with communities can actually do what you're saying here. So as you know, we have a really good team now at OPD, Office of Planning and Development at the New Hampshire Department of Business and Economic Affairs. And I think they have a really great housing toolbox, and they have great resources of other states. And I think marrying that research with the rollout that'll be under their department of the new Housing Champion communities, and aligning that with dollars and investments is really a place for us to think about growing as a state, because it's a carrot approach for the community. And when the community says, yes, I want to build housing, but hey, we're on septic, what do we do? Let's make sure they have the technical assistance, and let's make sure they have some infrastructure dollars to do something about that. Obviously, we're not asking to build places that can't sustain a healthy population. That would not be a good solution. But I think what that study commission rather under Senator Fuller Clark identified is that we have the science and we have the tools, but we're not communicating. So it's my hope that through Housing Champions, we can pull that all together. So that is a great point. Thank you for the question.
So, in regard to our unhoused population in New Hampshire, do you have any idea what it would cost to provide shelter that's a safe place for them to stay? And then we also had a question kind of confirming the number of unhoused folks we have in the state.
Okay, great. The first question was costs related to providing a shelter bed. This is an interesting question. For a long time, we've been using the data point that it costs $42 per bed night, and the state for a long time was reimbursing that bed night at $8. The last couple of budget cycles, we've gotten it up to $20. But even then, it wasn't enough. So we had to have an emergency appropriation last year to keep some of the major shelters open over the summer months. But I had some shelter providers communicate with me that that number they felt was too low. And that makes sense, right? Because if you're operating a shelter in Portsmouth, your overhead could be different than operating a shelter, say, in the North Country. And so Crossroads had a per bed night that was over $50 per night. And of course, that makes sense. Everyone has different, and you're paying in a different competitive workforce, in a different marketplace as well. So I think there's obviously a range of overhead, but please know that the state does not reimburse even half of the cost of what it takes. And so that means that for some essential services, if you think about shelter, it's really the very, very bottom of the safety net, right? You've fallen through every crack and now you really don't, you're living outside. So if the state thinks that it has a role in providing, just a basic safe place to sleep, then I think there's a strong argument that we just need a more sustainable funding model. Or and also our shelters are doing incredible work. I mean, compared to other states, our unhoused numbers should be higher, but we just have such incredible people. But they're supplementing, they're essentially taking the burden off the taxpayer and supplementing what it takes to provide shelter at a very high rate. I know at Crossroads, I live in Portsmouth, Crossroads is, half of its budget is provided by the community. And so I think we're not going to be able to sustain a shelter system, a safe shelter system, if we don't have a more sustainable funding model. And I'm sorry, what the next question was? Someone didn't like my data point. I didn't know. Casey, can you remind me what it was? Oh, is the number of homeless around 3,000?
Yeah.
So it's actually, there are two numbers I shared with you. One is just over 2,000, and the other one's over 3,000. And I know that is a confusing way, but one comes from HUD and how they define homelessness, and one comes from the Department of Education. And so one includes folks doubled up essentially, and the other one does not. I do want to say something else about this, how we capture data. During the pandemic, everyone, when we had many folks living in hotels, for the first time, we were able to count actual homeless people in a very real way because everyone living in a hotel got counted. Now, those programs don't exist anymore, and most of those people did not find permanent housing after they left the hotel. Some did. But I think it gives a sense of that generally the counts are pretty low. And so, HUD will tell you, well, that's what we have, that's how we count it every year. So, if you go up, you're going up by that basis point. I think we can also see by the visible increase in encampments in our state that that we have an issue that we need addressing, and we need a shelter system that is more welcoming, and we need a solution to encampments that's more effective. And it's going to take funding to do that. Thank you for those questions.
I would love to throw two more your way, Alyssa, if you're
Sure,
okay.
of course.
So a question we had from Dave Trumbull in the chat, there's a big difference in the median income in different counties. Could you talk a little bit about what changes could be made to make programs more accessible in the counties that have a lower median income?
Yeah, I mean, that is a good question. And I want to direct you, and I can share this with Zach and Casey when I send my PowerPoint to the in-depth report that just came out like 2 weeks ago from New Hampshire Housing. And so you can see how rents versus median income in regions around the state. So you can get a better view locally of how the housing crisis is impacting your community. And then I want to say that the tools to address housing are income based. So you're income verified, and then you're asked to pay a percentage of your income. So if you're in a low income housing tax credit property, it's not like it's just everybody gets the same level of support. It's based on your income. So that and this is also interesting, as the cost of rents have come up, the overall cost to all of us nationally on these programs is going up. So a very high percentage of HUD's total budget is now dedicated to the voucher program, because the voucher is subsidizing a percentage of the market. So we have a collective interest in increasing production, because unless we do, we're not going to be able to bring down the cost of rental housing. And to Zach's point earlier about how, obviously, like a developer, our developers too, affordable housing developers pay property taxes, and given the high cost of housing, they spread the property tax, the fees through their tenancies. And that's true for affordable housing properties and market-based properties. So that's how the property tax ends up showing up in rents.
Yeah, and to build off that, there's a question like specifically about SWEPT on multifamily housing developers, and it's just like a normal property tax. So they are assessed that also, and there's no legal. They're legally allowed to pass it on because it's just another expense, right? It's just so if Concord, you assess your local property taxes. If you own a multifamily housing unit, you're also assessed the state property tax. Both of those are expenses, right? And you can pass on as much as you want or not and build it into what you decide to charge for rent, just like if you decide to include utilities or not. And so you're allowed to do that, right? And they are assessed SWEPT. It also opens though a really interesting question, right? That I kind of didn't bring up earlier, but if we were, say, to provide rebates or exemptions on SWEPT, an interesting question, which would be really good to incorporate folks like Alyssa and Housing Action, is how do we make sure when we're providing some of these rebates that they're finding the people that need them, right? So if we have like rebates or programs to help with property taxes, but maybe they're not getting passed on to renters, what are and I don't know the answer, but what are structures that, as we're looking at making sure housing costs are more affordable, for reducing property taxes, is it just for single family homeowners, right? But then it doesn't help rent. If it does go to multifamily owners, is there some obligation to pass that saving along to the renters? And that gets really complicated and really sticky, but those are really good questions to be considering as we're talking about how property taxes then trickle down or have an impact on rents.
Great. Okay, I think we'll end with one additional question for Zach. Zach, can you talk a little bit more about the homestead exemptions? So what kind of properties would not get an exemption? And how would we determine if property is eligible for a homestead exemption?
Yeah, in general, the homestead exemptions kind of by definition are your primary residence. So you could tie that to similar definitions around determining voting eligibility. So for example, if I live in Concord, and let's say I have a second home up in Jackson, New Hampshire, right? So I'm a New Hampshire resident for both, but where I vote, right? So where my kind of domicile there is, I'd get an exemption on that as my primary residence, not on my secondary residence. Same would be true for someone out of state, say in Massachusetts, owned a lake house in Wolfboro. They would not get that exemption because that home in Wolfboro is not their primary residence. They're not an in-state resident. So just be in-state residents and your primary residence, homeowners would get that. Again, that same thing I was just talking about, that opens up, if we're providing this homestead exemption, generally, my understanding is in other parts of the country and some of the things we've considered here is for homeowners' primary residence. And so if we just do that, or if we expand it to renters, or kind of like how do we do that to impact the rental market, it's a different question. But in general, the homestead exemption is kind of by definition your primary residence, which also would mean if someone only owns one home, but it's worth $3 million, they would still get that exemption. But it would be a smaller piece of their overall bill, as opposed to someone whose home is worth $300,000 or $400,000.
All right, well, that brings us to 11 o'clock. Zach and Alyssa, thank you so much for your time and efforts here today. Our next, last week is our last week of our candidate webinar series. On Tuesday, we will be with Moms Rising, and Thursday with Reaching Higher New Hampshire. Our recording of this, along with Alyssa and Zach's slides, will go out later this afternoon. Thank you all for being with us here today and for your questions. And Zach and Alyssa, I'll turn it back over to you if you'd like to say any last words to leave folks with before we close out here.
I'll just conclude by saying thanks, everyone. Nice to connect with you. We look forward to working with you on policy solutions to our housing crisis. And thanks very much for having me.
Likewise, thank you for continuing to attend, and I'll just echo what Alyssa said. Like, please lean on us, reach out to us for these issues, and if we don't know the answer, we might know some of our partner organizations that do, and we really want to continue being a resource for all of you. And thank you for running for office and for attending these. So I really appreciate it, and yeah, hope you all have a good rest of your Thursday.